On June 3rd, 1940, the last British troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. The Nazis bombed Paris, killing 45 people, and the Parliament case went to trial in federal court in New York. The preliminary hearings went on for 2 weeks before being suspended for private negotiations between the studios and the Department of Justice, with the heads of the studios desperate to save face, especially after 20th Century Fox executive Joseph M. Schenck was indicted on charges of income tax fraud. A deal was eventually worked out between the government and the studios, with the government seemingly giving in on the majority of the case. The deal resulted in the studios limiting the block booking, and in return they could keep their theatres. In the autumn of 1940, in private negotiations, the studios and the government finalised a consent decree which called off all pending antitrust lawsuits. At this moment in time, the Parliament case was dead in the water. This angered independent producers such as Walt Disney, David O. Selznick, Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles, and they wouldn't let this be the outcome. But World War II began and delayed any talk of antitrust violations. If the Depression helped the studios avoid a Supreme Court ruling in the early part of the 1930s, then World War II did the exact same a decade later. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, the United States officially entered the war on December 7, 1941. Hollywood played a major part in the war effort. Throughout this period, Hollywood began working with the Office of War Information, which enlisted Frank Capra for the Why We Fight series, a collective of propaganda films that were shown to soldiers. Film directors such as John Ford, George Stevens, William Wyler, and John Huston also all made films for the government. Stevens filmed footage at Dachau, which was used during the Nuremberg trials as evidence. Ford filmed the Battle of Midway as it was happening. Wyler made a film about the B-17 plane, the Memphis Belle, and John Huston produced a documentary about post-traumatic stress disorder entitled Let There Be Light. This film was banned by the US government until 1981. The Allied forces won the war in 1945, and it didn't take long for the independent producers to begin lobbying against the studios once again. A New York district court handed the studios down a guilty verdict on their practices. The exact ruling of this court neither satisfied the studios nor those lobbying against them, so the case headed to the Supreme Court. This is the big one, the one massive ruling that had 30 years of history and the future of the American film industry riding on it. In the case United States v. Paramount Incorporated 334 US 131, the Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in favour of abolishing the current practices of the studios. The studios were ordered to divest themselves of their own theatre chains. All the studios ultimately gave their consent decrees and complied with the Paramount case in its entirety. Vertical integration was no more. Coupled with the emergence of television, the cinema attendance plummeted over the next decade. In 1946, around 90 million people were going to the cinema each week. By 1960, that number dropped to 40 million. Arthur Devaney, in the book Hollywood Economics, talks about how the Paramount ruling was a total failure for the film industry. Since it is unlikely, though possible, that it became more profitable to sue distributors than to show their movies, we consider the high volume of exhibitor lawsuits to be an indicator that Paramount was a failure in the eyes of those it was intended to help. Other evidence shows that neither the independent exhibitors nor the film-going public benefited from the fall in the feature film production and rise in theatre prices and film rentals that followed Paramount. Now, Devaney is not wrong in what he says at all in regards to the economic impact of the Paramount ruling, but I do feel he is missing some of the larger points the effect had on the art of cinema itself. Without the Paramount decree, would we have had movies like Easy Rider? Would we have seen the rise of filmmakers like Martin Scorsese through the studio system? Maybe his talent would shine through, but the studios were not making the type of films that independent filmmakers were making in the late 1960s. If the studios were not forced to end vertical integration, we may have never gotten the American New Wave, and cinema as an art form would be way less interesting because of that. The golden age of Hollywood was great, but it had its time. It was now up to a new generation of filmmakers to shape American cinema in their own vision. With the rise of television, the studios looked to create a different form of cinematic experiences during the 1950s and 60s. They looked to CinemaScope and Cinerama, which widened the length of the stream by doubling the aspect ratio from the traditional Academy format, so the films could not be replicated on television and could only be seen in the cinema. But the decline in cinema attendances was not, in my opinion, a technical problem that the studios could solve. It was a social and cultural shift that went far beyond the art of cinema into how Americans lived their lives following World War II and into the golden age of capitalism. When the greatest generation came back from war, they didn't go back to the cities of their youth. They went to live in suburban neighbourhoods, where they didn't attend the cinemas regularly. Why would they? They were the first generation to have a television in their home, and they had children to raise. Audience attendances bottomed out in the late 1960s, and it wasn't until their children's generation, the baby boomers, came of age that audience figures began to increase, and a new style of American cinema based on realism and funded independently was led by filmmakers such as Martin Scorsese, Dennis Hopper, Francis Ford Coppola, and Brian De Palma, who spoke to this new generation. The studios were no longer in the exhibition business, and were at their lowest point, but as you know, because the majority of the studios still exist in some form, they did survive, and how that exactly happened, well, that's a story for another video.